Welcome to the Building Web3 Podcast. I have my good friend Alexei. He is the co-founder of Bob. So before we get too deep into Bob, give us a brief background into how you got into this crypto space.
So, hey, thanks for having me. I've been doing this for almost 10 years now. It's going to be 10 years in January. And I got into it through pure coincidence. I was doing a bachelor's thesis in computer science and was always interested in IT security and I was looking at like how to hide Tor traffic behind Skype traffic, was told to look at, do some research, obviously bumped into Silk Road. That's where people were, trying to hide that they were going there. And then kind of pivoted and ended up working really on Bitcoin and what else we could do with it. I always was very fascinated with things we could do with the technology, not just, payments, but I really got excited about Namecoin, the first altcoin, Decentralized DNS. And from there, it's been a bit of a random walk through kind of the different areas of blockchain research. So worked on payment channels, color coins, decentralized mining pools. And then I ended up doing a PhD at Imperial College in London, focusing on distributed systems in blockchain. So really focused on the protocol level designs of bridges, sidechains, and really doubled down on ways to get Bitcoin to other ecosystems or build sidechains so it could be more useful. And how do we build bridges? And yeah, we've been working on building bridges and Bitcoin sidechains for the last 5 years as a company as well.
Now, let's say somebody, most of our people here are founders and builders, but let's say somebody hasn't been too immersed in the Bitcoin ecosystem and kind of remembers it from the old digital gold narratives. Talk to us a little bit about like some of the Bitcoin renaissance and what you guys are doing over at Bob.
So I think one of the interesting things about Bitcoin and the Bitcoin renaissance is that 99+% of the altcoins started off with, I can do this because Bitcoin can't. So I'm going to build something that, has faster block times, bigger blocks. And then Ethereum came around, obviously, in a much more successful manner and said, well, let's do smart contracts. And then you have this whole plethora of other networks that try to be more specialized, faster, multi-chain. But then I think what we realized is, well, wait a second, we can do these things on Bitcoin as layer twos. And with BitVM, this new technological innovation, we could do these things on Bitcoin. And that changes everything because suddenly everything could be on Bitcoin. So there's like, it kind of changes, I think, the narrative for alt L1s. Because if you can do everything on Bitcoin and tap into the biggest pool of liquidity, tap into the biggest user base, and essentially also use the most secure network for your security of your system, how much benefit is there to launching a separate L1 or going to another ecosystem? And that, I think, is what really triggered the renaissance. Of course, there's a massive shift in community, and the ordinals community had a big say in this, really changing the way we work on Bitcoin. Previously, for a long, long time, innovation was shunned. After the block size wars, this kind of Bitcoin civil war, people were very careful and cautious. And now it's okay to talk about new things, new opcodes, building stuff on Bitcoin. Even if it's just, storing data as images, it's still new use cases and it's totally okay suddenly. And the combination of these two kind of, the technological advancements and the shift in community trigger this renaissance. And for Bob, what we're trying to do is we're trying to bring innovation back to Bitcoin as a Bitcoin layer 2, but our approach is slightly different. We believe that there will be a multi-chain future. There will be more than one layer one. ETH is not going away. It's been doing very well. Maybe Solana would stick around for another 10 years. We don't know. But there is one thing that we do want to change, and that's how Bitcoin is used. And what we want to achieve is that when you're using Bitcoin for DeFi and trading and lending and just in all these novel Web3 use cases, that you don't have to go to centralized exchanges, but you don't have to leave Bitcoin to go to Ethereum either. The vision that we have is that you could deposit your assets into a layer 2 that has Bitcoin security, where your Bitcoin cannot be stolen because the bridge is trust minimized, but you could also trade against the assets of ETH users. And ETH users can deposit assets, in their ETH and ERC20s into Bob, and they also know that they can always get their assets back as long as Bitcoin is secure. And the design that we have conceived here is the so-called hybrid L2, where using Bitcoin as the anchor system, Bitcoin as, I guess, the settlement layer, we can create a network or a platform specifically for DeFi and built on top of Bitcoin with Bitcoin as the main asset, but also in a way where you don't need third-party bridges when you're connecting from Ethereum, from ETH, from Base, from Avalanche, from Solana. And you could essentially create, I guess, something that Cosmos and Polkadot and also now Optimism with the superchain are trying to do, or Agalayer on the Polygon ecosystem, where you have this one layer that kind of allows you to go between these different L2s. Well, we found a way that how we can do this on Bitcoin. So if you're bridging your assets from Solana into Bob, you would always be able to get them back to Solana as long as Bitcoin is secure. And same, if you bridge Sol, you trade it for ETH, you withdraw back to ETH. Again, you can do that as long as Bitcoin is secure. And of course, you can trade against Bitcoin and stablecoins. And realistically, ETH, Bitcoin, stablecoins are 95% of the market today, but that might change in the future. And the motivation here is, we can get all this innovation back to Bitcoin, fees accrue back to Bitcoin. You don't fragment Bitcoin liquidity across dozens of alt L1s, but it stays within this Bitcoin layer 2 ecosystem. But at the same time, we essentially, I think, all can agree on one thing, right? Whether you're an ETH user, a Solana user, a Polkadot maxi, a Cosmos maxi, there's one thing we can all agree on, is that Bitcoin is secure. Whenever we get up to work every day, we assume Bitcoin works. So if Bitcoin breaks, everything goes down the drain. And that's, I think, that's why it's such an easy sell to go to people and say, well, look, you can deposit assets from any L1 into this platform and it's secured by Bitcoin. And of course, you have access to this huge liquidity pool of Bitcoin in a trust minimized way as well.
Yeah. So I think one thing that I always like to do with guests is kind of walk through the life of a transaction. So let's say we have some crypto natives, they've got a little bit of Bitcoin, they've got some Ethereum, they've got some Solana. Talk to us a little bit about like what they can do on Bob and like how they would interact with it. Like what's kind of the onboarding and experience of a user on Bob?
So the cool thing about the hybrid design is, like, let's say starting from Ethereum and a user that is familiar with the ETH and ETH2 ecosystem, today, like Bob, and in the future, you'd be able to deposit your assets into Bob in the same way you can deposit into Arbitrum or Optimism or Base. And because Bob also under the hood uses the OP stack, because we feel that this is like the most advanced and most robust kind of technology stack, and it uses the EVM, because again, it's better for go-to-market, has better infrastructure, and it's just, in my opinion, the best smart contract paradigm out there right now. Well, it's very easy for you to interact with apps because you can use your MetaMask, or you can use 350 other EVM wallets. You can use your Ledger, but you can also use Bitcoin in the same way you're using Ethereum. And once BitVM and this kind of new bridge design is ready, you'll be able to use Bitcoin in a way that you know that cannot be stolen. Just like when you're using Arbitrum, when you deposit ETH into Arbitrum, you assume that it can't be stolen because they're fraud proofs, because you can always get it out. And that's essentially the kind of interesting aspect here. You're not leaving the ETH ecosystem. It just looks and feels as if it's an L2, because it kind of is a layer 2.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned BitVM. I'm trying to think what other guests have mentioned that. Maybe just the team from BitLayer and a few other people. So real quick, if people are unfamiliar with what BitVM introduced, talk to them a little bit about like what the technology there is and like kind of what is that enabling?
So BitVM is, and I think the name is sometimes slightly confusing. It's not a virtual machine. It's not like the EVM. It's not a new smart contract language. What BitVM is, it's a fraud-proof mechanism for Bitcoin. You can take any computation, and of course, like if we're smart about it, we just take the full virtual EVM, because then we can run anything anyway, and you just plug it into Bitcoin in a way that if something goes wrong, we can challenge and prove that something went wrong. So think of it, with BitVM, we can build an Arbitrum or an Optimism with fraud proofs directly on Bitcoin. Now, we can also use it specifically to improve bridging, because obviously one of the very exciting pieces and most relevant pieces of technology in a layer 2 is the bridging aspect. You can deposit your assets and you can always get them out. So what BitVM allows us to do, it allows us to change the trust assumption of these bridges that we have on Bitcoin today from multi-sigs and, honest majority. And if you have a 3 out of 5 multi-sig, if 3 people are malicious, they can do whatever they want. They can steal the money. On the contrary, in BitVM, if you have, let's say, 5 operators or 50 operators, even if they're all bad, they're all trying to steal, they can't, because they'll get challenged and kicked out one after the other. And that just is such a different security model. It's so much better because it's secure as long as there's someone in the network on Bitcoin that pays attention. And this can be you and me, anyone on the call, right? And if anyone listening to this could just run this node, it can maybe be compressed to run on mobile phones, and then you just challenge if something goes wrong. And in short, again, the easiest way to try to understand BitVM is it's swap proofs. And what it allows us to do is it allows us to create layer 2s on Bitcoin, and specifically in the near future, because as we know on Ethereum, rollups are, it's also kind of still in the making. But what we can certainly do within the next couple of months is trust minimize bridges as a first step. Deposit your Bitcoin, and you can always get it out as long as there's someone in the network that will do a challenge.
And so you talked about some of the features of Bob. Talk to us a little bit. I remember reading that you guys have some liquid staking new feature. Talk to us a little bit about some of the existing features on Bob and kind of where things are moving towards.
So we take this hybrid kind of positioning seriously, not only from the tech perspective, but also from the product perspective. And with the advent of Bitcoin staking, where you can use Bitcoin as an asset to secure other protocols, so-called AVSs, so actively validated services, just like Eigenlayer basically allows us to do that on Ethereum. This suddenly gives Bitcoin a completely different utility. You can now stake it, just you would stake your ETH, and you're actually earning returns based on whatever the protocol that is using Bitcoin as security is willing to pay for it. And Babylon is obviously one of the leaders in the space. They have received a lot of traction and have made a lot of progress on productizing this new technology. And what Bob has done is we've thought, of course, about doing our own staking, but we decided to rather focus on the product side of this. And what we've launched is something we call BobStake, and that's an aggregator that allows you as a user to go to one interface and stake your Bitcoin across all of these different staking products. Now, when I say staking products, there are generally 3 types. There is the Bitcoin staking as we know it from Babylon, so similar to Eigenlayer, where you stake your Bitcoin and it's used to secure other networks. And then there's, of course, the liquid representations of that. So LSTs, LRTs, where you stake your Bitcoin and you still get a tokenized representation of that, which is earning staking rewards, but you can still use it in DeFi as collateral. And that's obviously super exciting. The same thing you can do with DeFi vaults. Once there's enough liquidity, you can run strategies like stable swaps, lending out Bitcoin in DeFi, but you still have a tokenized representation of that BTC that is generating returns. And last but not least, we have these CDeFi strategies, things like Ethena, but using Bitcoin as the input asset. And there's also quite a few teams working on that. Now, already today, there's around 15 to 20 products that are on the market, and the majority of them is already either live or integrating with Bob. And what we've done hence is we've built this one aggregation where for you as a user, it's just one interface, one Bitcoin transaction to stake Bitcoin into any of these. And some of them can be compounded. So think about it this way. If you really want to be a bit more advanced in your strategies, you could go and you can stake your Bitcoin into Babylon, take that LST, put it into a lending protocol, borrow a stablecoin against it, and do something with that. But that is all compressed into one Bitcoin transactions. One click and you're done. And that means you don't have to hop to 5 different interfaces. You don't have to bridge in first and then look for the strategy. So that's one thing for the user. But of course, we think about distribution as well. And how do we get Bitcoin staking and these strategies into the hands of more users? How do we make this more accessible? Because that has been one of the biggest limitations of Bitcoin so far in DeFi. It's very hard to use. And that's where BobStake is also an SDK. It's one API integration for any wallet, staking aggregator, institutional custody provider, staking provider to just plug in and get access to all of these assets, all of these staking providers, staking strategies for Bitcoin. And our first partner on this front is stakingrewards.com. They have 3 million plus users. They are the leading aggregator for proof of stake asset staking. So ETH, Solana, Cosmos, Polkadot. And now they have a Bitcoin product. And the majority of the assets that are available in this Bitcoin product use BobStake as an underlying kind of layer. So it just makes it much easier for them to integrate and get access to dozens of protocols. And then we just make sure we support them all. We make it easy for them to integrate. And it becomes a win-win. For wallets and like platforms like Staking Rewards, it's one integration. For LSTs and Bitcoin staking products, it's access to dozens of distribution channels. Instead of negotiating and going and integrating with them individually, it's just a whole package. And that's already live. And I think this is one of the ways to just grow the Bitcoin staking ecosystem much, much faster and consolidate it and make it easier for both retail power users, degens, but also institutional capital to access that.
Yeah, it's very. So let's imagine I have, tomorrow we create Jack's wallet and we want to add in Bitcoin staking. Is it, hey, we just go to Bob's site, we download the SDK, we integrate it with our wallet, and then boom, our customers are then able to access like a certain amount of APY if they have Bitcoin in their wallet?
Yeah, I mean, the APY, it really depends. Like there's what you get is you get suddenly 10, 15, in the future 20 strategies, which can be very simple, like, okay, stake your Bitcoin to Babylon, or more complex, like, oh, you're deploying into a DeFi vault that does a few certain things, or they are like, they use exchange rate arbitrage for other strategies on centralized exchanges where there's generally still more liquidity than in DeFi for now. And you just like, you can, as a wallet provider, you can decide which strategies you actually support, or you just say all of them, and your users basically gives you this Bitcoin earn product out of the box.
Got it. Now, one thing historically, Bitcoin, I mean, we talked about like the Civil War and all of that kind of stuff, is they're a bit risk averse in terms of like, not my keys, not my coins, things of that nature. Talk to us a little bit about like the adoption. Are you seeing a lot of people start to stake Bitcoin? Are you seeing like good adoption in terms of like people taking their Bitcoin and putting it into DeFi products like BTCFi?
I mean, of course, time will tell. We're still in the very early stages, right? If you're staking a Bitcoin right now, you are, again, one of the first people to this Bitcoin renaissance. But we see the interest is really impressive. And I think that that's an observation that, we've made in the past over many, many years working in Bitcoin now is everyone's a Bitcoiner. ETH users have Bitcoin, Solana users have Bitcoin. They're just used to using things in DeFi. They couldn't use Bitcoin and DeFi before unless they would use WBTC, and that was quite hard to access, right? Because it's institutional, you have to go through KYC. There are some other on-ramps, but they're not as user-friendly. And now, well, suddenly and then also many people used to go to BlockFi, Celsius, and, look for yield there, but that wasn't transparent, and it was not quite clear what happened there, and it was it was going in that direction, but it blew up and it was poorly managed. And with liquid staking products, things like Babylon, that is non-custodial per se, right? But there's also like DeFi vaults are non-custodial. If you go the CDeFi route, you still have risks, but at least, you know where the assets are and you can use them in DeFi as well. And we were very surprised to see how much interest there is among institutions, among users. If you look at the Babylon staking cap, that gets maxed out every time it opens up. You have a couple of $100 million Bitcoin or dollars worth of Bitcoin already staked, even though Babylon hasn't properly launched the mainnet. And we see more and more Bitcoin products, like Bitcoin staking products, emerge. Solve has over $1 billion in TVL across a few of these projects. And, they were the first, and now there's 15 LST providers. So we can definitely see that there's a big population of users that actually want to put the Bitcoin to work. And now that they have better tools and better products available, they are going to do so. Now, whether you should or should not use your Bitcoin in DeFi, that is really up to you. Do your own research. I'm not telling you should put your Bitcoin at risk. But what we definitely see is that there is demand. And it's all about the security and how to make sure that the assets are custodied in a proper manner. And that's why we see there's going to be a balance between institutional products and institutional integrations where bigger funds and a lot of Bitcoin OGs are institutionalized at this point. They're going to use their favorite custodian to deploy Bitcoin into different protocols. But then you also have the more DeFi native way with things like BitVM. BitVM 2, the paper that we then co-authored also with Robin, that really gets us to this trust minimized bridging and way to deploy Bitcoin into DeFi. And I think as you said, Bitcoiners are very cautious. But the cool thing is you can cater to two types of users here, right? With institutional integrations, you cater to funds and people who just prefer the business risk. And there's a lot of people out there that still prefer the business risk. But it's more transparent now. And on the other side, with the progress that we're seeing on BitVM 2, you actually, over the next couple of months, will start seeing like people deposit Bitcoin into the system, probably initial people who are still much more open to risk because it's a new system, there's technical risk at the beginning. But the cool thing is with these kind of decentralized systems, the longer they exist, the more secure they become. And that for me is a clear blueprint and a roadmap to activating even the most conservative Bitcoin holders, because if we can prove that it's secure, first of all, on paper, and then over time, if we've implemented it, it's battle tested, then you can be convinced enough that it is actually okay to use a Bitcoin there. I mean, again, everybody has to decide whether they do it or not. But look at Lightning. It's okay to use Lightning in the more Bitcoin maxi crowd. And with BitVM, you can get to a similar security level and even greater adoption.
Absolutely. And we've seen a lot of layer twos, of course, in like the Ethereum space. We're even now seeing them on Solana, and now we're seeing them on Bitcoin. Talk to us a little bit about how you guys like work to differentiate yourselves. Like I'm sure retail users and institutional investors come in, they're like, wow, there's so many options. Talk to us a little bit about like your differentiation strategy.
So for Bob, it's two things. It's shipping great products, and Bob is spearheading the way with Bitcoin infrastructure. Things like BobStake, which nobody else has. It's infrastructure just that makes it easier to use Bitcoin and DeFi. And that is one hurdle that we've seen in the past for users ourselves, and it has always been difficult. But at the same time, we've also invested a lot and spearheaded the research around BitVM and specifically BitVM 2 and how to productize that and make it practical. And that again, I mean, there's 80 Bitcoin L2s. Pretty sure most of them don't know how BitVM works under the hood. It's very new, and we spent years working on bridges and sidechain designs. And I think the advantage that you see on Bob is we've learned how to productize these things and actually make sure that they're not just in theory possible, but actually can be done in a practical way. And that's why we spend so much time working on BitVM 2, which is, as opposed to the early BitVM versions and a lot of the forks that emerged from that, it's actually practical. It gets very close to ETH rollups in efficiency and security. And the last point of differentiation is that we've learned that, just taking the EVM and plugging it onto Bitcoin, that's not enough. Building in isolation isn't enough. Bob is a hybrid, and it's a unique design approach because it allows us to capture the network effects and the liquidity and the user bases of not just Bitcoin, but actually Bitcoin and Ethereum and other L1s in the future, and allows us not only to fight with other Bitcoin layer 2s or ETH layer 2s, it allows us to challenge other centralized exchanges. Because if you think about it, as mentioned at the start of the call, right, with this hybrid design, once completed, you'll be able to deposit your assets from any smart contract capable layer 1 into Bob and withdraw them as long as Bitcoin works. Now, with that actually is very similar to how exchanges work, right? You deposit from any L1, you trade against other assets and you withdraw, but you trust the exchange. In our model, you only trust that Bitcoin is working. And somewhere someone is online and will actually do a challenge. And this could be yourself. You could be the one running that challenger node. And that is such a change in security, and it's a 0 to 1 improvement. And I think that's a big differentiator.
Yeah, it's definitely an exciting future for Bitcoin and Bob as a whole. Now, one of our goals with the podcast is always to get more builders and founders into the space. What would you say are some of the like biggest challenges you guys have faced building the company, and how you've worked to overcome them? Was it like marketing? Was it fundraising? Was it just like kind of trying to convince people that like, hey, this is safe?
So, I mean, we've been building on Bitcoin in production, like really as a business for 5 years now. And one of the challenges we faced is really learning the hard way that just building tech and hoping that people will come doesn't work. And building in isolation doesn't work either. And just building for ethos is great, but it doesn't work. I think we often forget this in the blockchain space. We're building for decentralization and so on, but it has to be usable. And if we really want to get users and adoption, we have to be able to compete with Web2 systems. And specifically on Bitcoin, if we're building a Bitcoin layer 2 and it turns out that it would be more expensive or much slower or worse in any way in terms of user or developer experience than ETH L2s, nobody's going to use that. I think we're heading towards mass consumer adoption. That's what we're all pushing for. But does somebody in Buenos Aires or in Istanbul or in Bangkok really care if it's secured by Bitcoin or by Ethereum? No, they don't. And they will care if it's easier to use Bitcoin. And of course, if the majority of the open source community converges towards the more secure solution, then that's the one that will get more adoption. But people trust each other. And they will also, of course, look at fees and products and usability. And one of the lessons we've learned, and we've previously built in other ecosystems before kind of, really moving out and becoming independent of like third-party risk and working directly on Bitcoin, is that many L1s, L2s out there see themselves as deep tech companies, but they're actually not. They're software as a service businesses. And until you realize that, your ecosystem is not going to be successful, because we've experienced it firsthand being on the other receiving end. If you're not considered a product or a client, basically, if you're building a dApp on top of another platform, well, that's really, you're not going to get the support you need, and you won't be able to succeed as likely in that ecosystem, because, well, you're left alone and you're kind of building in isolation. Versus how we treat dApps and builders on Bob is, okay, if you're building on Bob, you're a client. Like, we need to make sure that you are successful, that you grow within the first few months, that you get users, you get liquidity, TVL, that you make money. Because the only way that the Bob L2 can generate fees and grow as an ecosystem is if the dApps are successful. And that switch in mindset took us a long time. And now we have this company internal doctrine, like, we don't want to talk about how great Bob is. And ideally, on these podcasts, I'd love to share more about the cool things you can build on Bob. You have all these DeFi projects, Bitcoin backed stablecoins. You have new innovations like tokenized hash rates, all these Bitcoin staking products that are launching. We love talking about their success stories. And I think that's something that, many people forget. And also many dApp builders often don't realize how important that is. And I know there's lots of, like, in times like these where, people in a vertical raise funding. And you had the same story with the ETH killers, right? Where everybody was throwing grants and giving like grants here, if come build and I'll give you a grant. Well, I've seen this debate as well on Twitter around Ethereum, and the discussion whether, it's a good idea to leave Ethereum and go build somewhere just for a grant. And I say, no, it's not. You should be really considerate whether the thing you're building on really aligns with your mission, whether the team or the developers of that think like you think, and whether your values are aligned. And only then you should go build there. Because if you're in an ecosystem, even if it's EVM compatible and you can switch out quickly, you're still stuck. You still have commitments. You still spend time in an ecosystem that might not be sustainable, that might actually not have that growth potential, but it gave you some money initially, and now you're stuck there. And that, I think, is a lesson we learned the hard way. And I think a lot of founders are kind of realizing this as well now.
Yeah, and you mentioned some of the exciting dApps that are building. So I have a two-part question. One is to kind of just expand upon some of the more exciting innovations you see on Bob from your dApp builders. And then we have a lot of builders in the audience, and we always like to ask, like, where do you think is an opportunity if somebody's like ready to build, where they should like get started, or what kind of product do you think would be interesting in that community? So talk to us, one, about the success stories you currently have, and then two, about like opportunities and areas people could build in.
So things that are already live on Bob are really focused around Bitcoin DeFi. So making it more accessible and building on top of the infrastructure that we have on Bob, building strategies for Bitcoin staking or Bitcoin earned products where you can one-click deploy into these different strategies. And you have Solve that supports, Babylon staking, Athena integrations, and like others. And I think they're currently the biggest provider there. But then we have a lot of smaller, newer teams emerging that try to specialize in certain areas and kind of optimize. And it creates this interesting competition. And when there's competition, this means that products get better and better. So we have Bedrock, we have Pump BTC, we have Acre, we have YieldFi, and there's many more that have not announced yet. That's why I'm not mentioning, because I don't want to leak too much alpha. That are trying to really offer you different strategies and try to be transparent and kind of provide you the best kind of risk return ratio on your BTC. And of course, do your own research. But then there's other things like Bitcoin-backed stablecoins, I think, are a very exciting use case. Bitcoin is the best collateral out there. And now that we have Bitcoin LSTs, you can use an LST as collateral. So you actually have a long exposure on Bitcoin that is actually generating some form of return, but then you can still use it to borrow a stablecoin or like mint a stablecoin. Then you can use that actually for further DeFi activities and so on. And then other things that I'm personally quite excited about. I mean, there's a ton of newer projects that are looking at more, I guess, exotic products. And I think that's also where we should be focusing on. I see that there's many teams that, go and try to replicate EMMs directly in the Bitcoin layer one, or build like just copy the things we saw on ETH, but just put it on the L1 on Bitcoin, which sure, it's on Bitcoin, but it's not as usable. Instead, what I think we should be focusing on is products that are not possible on Ethereum. And what is not possible on ETH? Well, things that use Bitcoin directly, right? That is what Bitcoin's biggest advantage is, the asset itself and the big user base. So things like tokenizing the Bitcoin hash rate, that is the real kind of base staking or like remission rate on Bitcoin. So doing things with that, I think, will be super interesting in the near future, because that makes mining itself more accessible and actually has an interesting kind of aspect for miners as well, which allows them to de-risk. But on the other hand, people can mine Bitcoin without having the machine at their home. And they can use it as collateral, because sure, you can do cloud mining, right? But then that's stuck there. And then there's like structural products where you can borrow against it, but now this is plugged into DeFi. And you have the full power of the EVM DeFi powerhouse behind it, but you're still actually mining Bitcoin. And then there's things that we've seen teams work on, and this is more exotic, this is not related to DeFi, but hybrid ordinals. I think ordinals are going to stick around. I think the value proposition of putting something onto Bitcoin, that's the most secure, maybe the most expensive database out there, and actually using that as a fungible and non-fungible asset is very powerful, and it is going to stick around it because it has a very unique value proposition as compared to NFTs. And what we've seen is teams and Bob trying to do is combine these two. Use Bitcoin for store of value, but then still have a kind of EVM compatible side that allows you to do more with it. And basically for things like gaming or also like tokenized artworks where you can fractionalize a bigger piece of art. I think that is actually super exciting. That is a completely different angle than DeFi, of course. But either the two things that we've seen kind of emerge more recently.
Yeah, I think those are very exciting. I also share from, I believe it was the Bedrock episode, they talked about building a dashboard for essentially liquid restaking, so you can see like all of your risk exposure amongst that. So like people, like if you feel like, hey, this is too confusing, dashboards, beautiful dashboards, I'm sure would get funding even from like a grant perspective. So builders, I think we need more dashboards.
Well, I mean, if I guess we were to try to simplify and just think about specific apps, dashboards really building on top of this BobStake interface and making it more accessible for people to run their strategies, building strategies, and think of like a Yearn or Summerfi, building these kind of things on top of this growing Bitcoin DeFi ecosystem is a pretty big opportunity. And, you can start small. And if you have a really good strategy and people love it, you'll grow very, very quickly just because the liquidity will flow in. And then there's, of course, the question of fragmentation of liquidity, right? There's so many different LSTs, I think, working on things that unify that. So kind of aggregators or synthetic assets that can be minted from different Bitcoin LSTs and combine them essentially like indexes. That I think is also quite exciting, easy to build, but the market is completely open and clearly somebody is going to do it.
Awesome. Well, guys, get to work. And finally, like, do you have any upcoming developments or like milestones that the community should be aware of?
So we, as mentioned, just released the BobStake product and other milestones in the near future. So we'll be doing more work on the Bitcoin staking side of things. Can't say too much, but we're working on making Bob the place where staking a Bitcoin would give you the highest returns, essentially. And in the sense of, and I shouldn't be saying that on camera, but in the sense of this being not incentivized, but actually plugged into Bob's fee system. So really aligning the interests of stakers with essentially the fee system of the Bob L2 itself, because that essentially can trigger this flywheel effect. So that's one thing without revealing too much there. And the other thing is obviously on the BitVM front, I believe, so there's been some recent developments where we believe that the timelines to seeing BitVM on testnet and then later on mainnet have been significantly reduced. And sure, while it might take time for people to gain confidence in new technology, getting it to market fast is super, super important, because that's when the clock starts ticking. The sooner you get it to mainnet, the sooner people start testing and kind of getting used to it. And I'm very optimistic that we'll see BitVM and like these trust minimized bridges with Bitcoins and like real Bitcoin L2 as a Bitcoin security next year. Like, I can't say the exact date, but very soon. And that's just going to accelerate this Bitcoin layer 2 ecosystem as well.
Absolutely. So some exciting things to look forward to. And finally, where can people connect with you online, go learn more about Bob?
I think the best place is on Twitter or on our website. So our website is gobob.xyz, or you can find Bob on Twitter. It's build_on_Bob. Or you can find me on Twitter. It's my full. It's very, very easy to find. It's my full name. So it's Alexei Zamyatin on Twitter.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. And to everyone, let's continue building the future of Web3.